Welcome back everyone to the React In-Depth series. In this video, we're going to go over a bunch of exercises together to get more practice with custom hooks in React. In the previous video, we looked at what custom hooks are, a few reasons why we might use them and where they'd be used. So this is just going to be a bunch more practice to actually get more familiarity with where and how to use them. I mentioned that there's many different cases where we could use them. We're using things like useState and useEffects and a couple other hooks, and we're mix and matching them so that we can reuse the logic. So it's nice to just get a bit more hands-on practice with how those work. So let's just get right to the exercises. Okay, so to start, I have all of these up on GitHub, so feel free to grab that from the description and clone it down if that's easier for you, or you can just pause the video like all the other exercises and kind of follow along with me as I kind of go through the instructions and give you a chance to try it yourself. So with a warm-up exercise here, let's just get our hands warmed up and then we can go into the main exercises right after that. So create a new Vite React project just so you can have everything set up. And I want you to create a file called useRerenderLogger.jsx and export a function of the same name. Then I want you to create another file called home.jsx and export a home component as well. The purpose of the useRerenderLogger function, as the name kind of implies, is to, it's a hook and it's going to log out kind of two different things. When the component first mounts that it's going to be used in, it's just going to log out a generic message that says component has mounted. And then whenever that component that it's being used in re-renders, regardless of what is being re-rendered, it's just always going to log out that component has re-rendered. Okay. So we should see component has mounted once or twice in dev mode when it's being used in that component. And then component has re-rendered is going to be run on mount as well as every subsequent state change in the component that's being used. So inside of home, I want you to then import and use this hook, the useRerenderLogger that you're going to create to make the log show up on mount and re-render. So I didn't go too deep into kind of what you need to actually set up the re-render loop that needs to happen. So you could create something like a stateful like an input that's a controlled input that changes some state, or you can create like a counter that changes some state. Anything that's going to change state that makes this re-render, I'm going to leave it up to you, a little bit more open-ended for these ones since we've seen those a bunch up until now. So make sure that you can test both the mounting and the re-rendering. The mounting should not show up after the mount, of course, and the re-render should show up every single time, including the first mount. So then you can replace the app with your home component in the main.jsx file if you're using Vite, and test if this works in your browser. So give that a shot and then we will go through it together. All right, so I'm going to create a new Vite project, npm create Vite at latest, and that's going to ask me for a project name. I'll just do custom-hooks-exercises. I'll use React there and JavaScript. Then I'm going to change into my custom hooks folder. I'm going to run npm install. While that's installing, I'm just going to pull up the source folder here. I'm going to create a new folder. I'll just call this Warmup just so I can put my files in there, since we are going to be duplicating some file names across exercises as we've done in the previous exercise videos. I'll create those two files. One is useRerenderLogger.jsx and the other is going to be home.jsx. All right, I'm going to go into my main. I'm just going to get rid of this index here. I don't want that, and I'll leave app in there for now. What I can then do is once that install is done, I can do npm run dev, and that's going to give me my dev server. I'm going to copy that link, switch over to Chrome, open a new tab and paste that in, and hopefully I get my my application. So there we go. I'm going to open up my inspector just so I have that ready so I can test some of these logs as they come through as well. And I'll open up the console as well. So there we go. So that's the app.jsx file that's rendering by default with Vite without the styling that's in the main, but we'll get rid of that shortly. So I'll just close off my terminal here. Now that's all set up, I'm going to switch over to my useRerenderLogger. So this is going to be a function. I'll just use the useRerenderLogger. It's a very long name. And I'll export this as a default, useRerenderLogger. Now this function is going to be a hook. So we're not going to be returning JSX in this case. We're going to return some stateful values or things that have to do with state, or maybe we don't return anything at all. Like in this particular case, we're actually going to just be using the useEffect hook to deal with different life cycles. So I'm going to import useEffect from React, and I want to do two things. I want to do a component mounted log, and then I want to do a component re-rendered log. So the mounted log we know is going to be a useEffect with an empty dependency array, right? We've seen this countless times until now, and we know that if we give a useEffect empty dependency, whatever code is in this callback function is going to run on mount. So in here, I'm going to put my console.log. I'll do component has mounted, and I'll just leave that there. Now I also know that if I do this, if I do a useEffect and I don't pass it any dependencies whatsoever, that this is going to run on every single re-render no matter what. This is very similar to have it almost the same as having it kind of out here in the scope of the actual component itself. However, this is going to run kind of not like asynchronously. I hesitate to say that word, but it's going to get scheduled to run later on so that it doesn't interrupt any kind of synchronous activities inside the hook or inside, in this case, the hook or the component. So it's better to put any code inside a useEffect if you do want to run it, generally speaking, especially things with side effects, which is really what it's meant for. And the console in this case technically is a side effect. So I'll say component has re-rendered. There we go. No dependencies for that one. And actually, that's really it, right? So this is kind of strange because this component is not, or this hook is not returning anything. So that feels kind of weird. It's actually returning undefined. So let's see how we're going to use this, right? This effectively is going to copy and paste whatever's code in here into the component that we're actually using it in. So let's go to home. I'm going to say function home, and I'm going to say export default home. And I want to import my hook. So I'm going to say import use re-render logger from use re-render logger.jsx. And the way that we're going to use this, actually first what I'll do is I'll just return, let me just return some JSX here. I'll just put an H1 and I'll just say home. Okay. And I'm going to put my use re-render logger in here, and I'm just going to call it just like that. Okay. So the way to think about this is all this code right here, these use effects are effectively just going to get copied and pasted right here. So we should see those two use effects basically right over here, and they're going to run as we'd expect, as if we just wrote them inside home, but now we can use it as many times as we want across components or even multiple times in this one component. So I'm going to go to my main now. I'm going to import, I'm going to comment out the app there, and I'm going to say import home from my Warmup directory. I'm going to make sure to add the extension. And I'm going to say home instead of app here. So I'm going to replace that. And if I switch back to Chrome here, we see home is there, and I'm going to refresh the page. And what we'll see is exactly what we wanted, right? We see it twice because it's running in dev mode and strict mode, but we see component has mounted and component has re-rendered. And this, the re-rendered run is always going to happen because a mount technically is the first render. Even though it's not a re-rendered per se, it is technically a render. So we will see both of these logged out, and again, twice because of the dev mode, strict mode. So let's test the actual re-rendering though, because this is just testing the mount. So if I switch to home, what I'll do is I'll just, I'll switch it up for the exercises, but for now, you know what, I'll just do a useState. So I want to import useState because I need to have something to re-render the component to test that it's actually re-rendering as we'd expect. And I will put this here. So I'll say const, let's just do count, set count is equal to a useState, and I'll start it at 0. And here I'll put a button and I'll say go up. And over here, I will put a H2, why not? And I will put the count inside there. And then the on click for the button is going to do a set count. I'll just do this in line just so it's a bit faster. This is going to take the previous count. In this case, I can also just say count plus 1. I'm only using it once in this case. I'm not really using multiple times, so I don't have to use the previous version, like the callback version in here. So this is acceptable. It's not a big deal if we do it this way with this version of set state. So if I switch back here, I'll refresh the page. And we'll see exactly what we saw before, right? Component has mounted, component has re-rendered. I'll just highlight these so we can know that this is the kind of old stuff that was there. I'm going to click go up. What that's going to do, it's going to change the state for count. and we're going to re-render this. And in the process of re-rendering, that means we're running home again, which means all this code is going to run again, including our use effects that are set up to run at particular times. Specifically, in this case, this use effect right here, which is set up to run on every single re-render. We should see it run every single time we click that button. So let's see if that's true. I click go up. Indeed, I don't know why it highlighted multiple things there, but there we go. So component has re-rendered. I click it again. Component has re-rendered. Click, 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 click. You can see that it does go up, and indeed we do see that re-rendered every single time that's being that re-render is happening. But we don't see component has mounted because it's already been mounted and we haven't unmounted it. So it's only actually re-rendering, which is kind of nice. So now we can use this hook multiple times, right? So just for fun, I'll just show you what happens. Like if we put this in here twice, and I refresh the page, we'll just see it happen twice, right? And if I clear this and I click this, we'll see the re-render happen 2 times every single click instead, because that's what it's set up to do with our hooks here. So there we go. So that is the warm-up exercise. Hopefully that one makes sense. Let's take a look at exercise 1 together. All right. Now this one is exciting. This is actually quite a common one that we will see when you're actually building tools in your own projects. Is authentication is quite a common kind of pain points that we'll see when we're dealing with different front-end applications. We want to make sure that the user is logged in or not logged in, and we want to detect when that state changes, because maybe we'll show, for example, like a profile section or a little picture or something, or even certain extra functionality, and we need to know whether to show that conditionally on the front end, depending on if they're logged in or not. So usually what we'd use is some kind of hook to actually do that, and we could pass that down maybe through a context or through some kind of state at the top level of the component, or even if it's not, it really just depends how we're actually using this through a third-party custom hook or for something we build ourselves. So in this case, I just want to demo a little bit of that behavior so you can kind of have a mental model for how that might work when you actually see this in your own components. We're going to create a hook called useAuth.jsx, and we're going to export a function of that name. Then we're going to create a file, same as before, home.jsx. You can call this whatever you like, and export a home component as well. Then what I want you to do is make useAuth return a single value which is stateful. Okay, that's a keyword, a stateful value, and this is going to be a Boolean value, so true or false. And that's going to be this is going to keep track if the user is logged in or not logged in. So that's the purpose of this state inside of this hook. So the goal is to make it so that this hook changes this value from false, which is the initial default value of this state, to true after a few seconds of it mounting in the DOM, okay? Or in the component that we're going to be using it in once that gets mounted in the DOM. So this hook is meant to basically toggle a logged in value from false to true after a few seconds. You can change the amount of seconds, maybe like 2 or 3 or 5 or something like that, and make sure that it works. Now, to test that it works, what we're going to do is we're going to import this useAuth hook into our home component that I just mentioned. And we're going to render an h1 in home that says not authenticated if that hook is returning false, which means that we're not logged in. And if it's returning true, we're going to render your profile in an h1 instead of not authenticated. So we can actually visually conditionally see in our DOM when that state gets toggled through this hook. Okay, then we want to replace our app with home inside main and test that it works. So what we should see is our h1 should change after the amount of seconds that we set for the login state to change to true. All right, so hopefully that makes sense. Give that your best shot, and then we will go through this together. Okay, so I'm going to create a new file here. I'll just call this ex1. New folder, sorry. I'll do a useAuth.auth.jsx, and I will do a home.jsx. All right, so the fun one, the useAuth.jsx. This is going to be a function, useAuth. We're not going to give it any parameters, so we don't need to pass this function anything. And this function is going to take stateful values, and it's going to toggle them from true to false. And it's also going to do that when the component mounts. So we know that we need state at the very least. So I'm going to say useState. I'm going to import that. So I'll say const logged in and set logged in. And this is going to be equal to useState of false to start, because we're going to be not logged in to start. Now, I said that I want to make this toggle to be true after a few seconds. So how do we do that? Well, if we go back to the instructions here, we said that we want to keep track if it's logged in or not. And then after a few seconds of it mounting in the component that it's used in. So whenever you see something like that, you want to think of probably something like the useEffect hook. We have some side effect that's going to happen as a result of some life cycle, in this case, the mounting of this component. And this indeed is going to be a side effect because we're actually going to be using probably something like a set timeout because we want to wait a certain number of seconds. So let me show you what I mean. I'm going to import useEffect, and I'm going to tell this useEffect, hey, please run only on mount, this function right here. And to do that, empty dependency array right here. And what do I want to do when this hook mounts into the component that it's being used in? Well, I want to do a set timeout. And this set timeout is going to take a callback function to run after a certain number of seconds. Let me just do, I don't know, 3 seconds, 3,000 milliseconds, just so that we have some time to switch back and forth and maybe change this if it's too short. What do I want to do after 3 seconds? Well, I want to set logged in to be true. Okay, so I'm going to set logged in to be true after 3 seconds of this component mounting into the DOM. Okay, so there's quite a lot going on here, right? This seems trivial if you just kind of skim through the code, but there's actually a lot of kind of action happening here. We have some state, we have some useEffect, we have something being scheduled to run in the event loop that's going to change that state and then cause this entire component or hook to rerun. Now, what do I want to return? Well, the component that's going to be using this only cares if we're logged in or not logged in. So it doesn't actually need a way to change this internal state. It should only care whether it's logged in or not logged in. So we don't actually want to return set logged in because that's internal to this component. So I'm simply going to return logged in, and the component that's using this hook can simply check to see if it's true or false. Now, there's an issue with this, which I'll mention shortly, but let's just see if this works really quick. So I'm going to go to my home in my ex1 folder. I'm going to create a function home. I'll do export default home. And did I export my use? I did not. So export default useAuth. All right. So I'll import that into my home because I know I'm going to use it. So I'm going to say import useAuth from my useAuth.jsx. Now I'm going to do this. I'm going to say const logged in, and this name doesn't matter, right? This name is irrelevant to what's being returned here. We can call the return value whatever we want. I'm just going to keep it consistent so it's easy for us to understand what's happening. I'm going to say useAuth with no arguments because it doesn't take any arguments. Now this is either going to be true or false. We're going to have a Boolean value. And I want to conditionally render something depending on what this Boolean value is. So I'm going to say return if logged, not console log, logged in is true. What do I want to return? I'll say h1, and I'll say, I forget what the exercise said. Let's see. If we scroll down here, it's supposed to say your profile. So I'll say your profile. And if it's false, then I want to return not authenticated. Authenticated. There we go. All right. So this is a ternary conditional statement that's returning JSX depending on the state of logged in. Now, think about this for a second. Before we look at the results of this, I want you to think, what are we going to see in the DOM and how is it going to kind of play out? Before you even look at it, I want you to think what's going to happen. Okay. So I'm going to switch to main. And I'll comment out this home here, and I'll say import home from ex1 / home.jsx. Oops, there we go. And the name is the same, so I can keep that in there. Okay, so are you ready? I'll switch back. Oh, I was logged in. Okay, let me refresh the page, and let's see what happens. So not authenticated, 1, 2, 3, your profile. Let's try it again. Refresh. 1, 2, 3. I'm not counting seconds properly, and it switches to your profile. All right, so that's pretty good, right? That's exactly what we expect. So what's happening is our hook is running, and it's switching or it's starting off as false for logged in, and we're returning false from this function, but it's a stateful value. And then this use effect is going to run a timeout after 3 seconds. It's going to statefully change, called the set state for logged in. And we know every single time a state changes, the component that is using that state is going to re-render, which in this case is home. Home is using this stateful value, which is being returned, but it's just being returned from another component. But again, picture this being copied and pasted into home, which means that this is going to change from false to true. And instead of seeing not authenticated, which is a false value, we'll see the true value, which is your profile. Now, the issue with this is that every time we use this in a component, we're going to get a different value, because every single stateful value in this case is independent of the other. So this is not exactly how you would see it work across a big application. Just the concepts are the same. We would only want one version of the stateful value at the very top level of our component that we could share down with all of our other components. And we would want to make sure that no other component really uses that, so or changes it or tries to reset it or something. So and if it is being reset, we want to make sure that that's a very controlled reset. So usually the way that you would see this kind of hook set up, if you're not using a third-party library, is maybe some kind of context, maybe some kind of reducer to dispatch to that stateful value in the context, so that any component can technically log you out. For example, if I click a log out button, every component will get updated. But generally speaking, we'd only have that value, that stateful value, stored in one place. We wouldn't be duplicating that state all the way across every single component. The actual stateful value itself is only in one place. In this case, if we use useAuth across multiple components, each component would get its own version, because it's having its own state in this case, which is not what we would expect to happen. We'd want to share that state in one place with maybe something like a context. Okay, so hopefully that one makes sense. That's a pretty fun one, pretty common that you'll see out there in the wild. Let's take a look at exercise 2. Okay. So now we're going to start getting a bit funky with some of these exercises. It's going to get more challenging, so do your best with these. So for this one, create a new Veep project. I think I said that for the last one, or reuse the existing one that you have, which is what I'll do. We want you to create a file called useState with logger.jsx and export a function of the same name. Same thing as before, create a file called home.jsx and export a home component. Now here is kind of the crux of this exercise. We want to make useState with logger a function that takes the same arguments, or in this case, argument, single argument, as useState, okay, the initial state. This will log out state has changed from old value to new value, where old value is the previous state before the change, and new value is a new state after the state change. Okay, useState with logger should return the state and set state equivalents just like useState. So before I go further here, I just want to kind of hopefully put that in English a bit easier. I mean, it's already in English, but like just kind of zoom out a little bit so it makes more sense. We're effectively trying to make a useState hook, but one that just automatically will log when the state has changed. Okay, that's all we're doing. So it sounds like that's all we're doing, but it's a bit more, there's a bit more nuanced than that, right? So we want to make sure that when that state is changed, when that set state function is being called, we are automatically logging that it's changed. And we also want to log what it's being changed from, which is the old value, and what it's being changed to, which is the new value. Okay, and we should be able to use this function right here, useState with logger, as if it's just a regular useState. Okay, so there should be functionally no difference from the end user that this is useState. It's just useState with logger if we want logging on there. All right, now here is a little bit of a wrench that I'm going to throw at you. Note that set state, like the set state value that we get back from calling the original useState hook, can take a value or a function. Okay, now recall that we can effectively do, we can kind of do something like this. We can say like set state of like state plus 1, for example, like if it's a number, or we can do like set state of previous, and we can do like previous plus 1. So these are kind of the two ways that we can call the set state function. We should be able to support both of these because it should be seamless for the end user of our function to use this in either way that they need. All right, so this is a little bit of a tricky part that you're going to have to also keep in mind as we're doing this. So don't forget this. I would suggest if you want, you can first only work on supporting this, make sure that you understand how that works. Then you can test it with something like this to make sure that that works too. Okay. Now to test it, inside home, you're going to import and use this useState with logger and make the log show up when a state inside home is changed. So for example, you can make it like a counter like we saw previously, or you can make an input that's stateful or like a toggle value or something. So add whatever you need to trigger the re-renders inside home so that you can test this useState with logger actually is changing the state as you'd expect. So replace the app with home inside main.jsx, test it all works in your browser. And here's a hint for you that might be helpful. You can use useRef to keep track of previous values of state. All right, that's all I will say. Hopefully you can use that hint to your advantage. There are many ways to do this. That is probably one of the simpler ones. So give that your best shot and then we will go through it together. All right, so I will create a new file in source or new folder. I always say file ex2. Let me just make this useState with logger, always long names, .jsx, and I'll create the home.jsx. Okay, now in here I'm going to create a function useState with logger, and we're going to export default useState with logger. There we go. Okay, now how is this hook going to work? Let's think about this for a second. So I'm actually just going to kind of pretend that this works for a second, and we'll see a demo of how this is supposed to work after we actually solve it. So I'm going to go to my home component. I'm going to do function home, and I'm going to export default home. And in here, I'm going to import my hook useState with logger. Always have to have the extension. I should really find a way to fix that. .jsx. And I should be able to say, let's go with counter again. Why not? So I'll say count, set count is equal to, and I should be able to use this in place of useState. So as if this is useState. So I'm going to start this count at 0. And what I should be able to do is I should be able to do this. I should be able to say return. And in here, I'll do this and I'll just say h1. I'll just say counter. And you know what, why not? I'll just put this over here. I'll just say count, and I'll put a button and I'll just say go up, and the on click is going to take set count and it's going to say count +1. And I'm going to change this so that we can see that it works both ways. In fact, I'll say go up by 1, and I'll create another one and I'll say go up by 5. Why not? And this is going to use the other syntax. I'll say previous value and then previous +5. All right, there we go. Almost off the screen, but I think you can see that. I'm just going to create both of these versions of set count to make sure that I can actually make them work. Okay, so this is the goal of this exercise, to make this work, but also for this to actually automatically log for us without us having to worry about doing that ourselves if we're interested in the state change being logged. So for example, when I click on this button right here, it's going to say previous value was 0, new value was 1. If I click on this one here, it's going to say previous value was, if I click at first 0, and then new value is 5, for example. Okay. Cool. So in my useState with logger, I know, well, if I go back to home, we're going to be passing it the initial value. So I'm going to grab that. So I'll say initial state, and I'm going to create a useState hook in here. There we go. So I'm going to say const, and this is going to be a generic logger. So I'm just going to say state and then set state. Okay, because this might not be for count, this might be for something else. This is going to be useState, and we're going to set that to be the initial state. Okay, all right, so let's think about this. We want to be able to log that the state has changed every single time the state changes, right? And when does the state change? Well, the state changes when set state is called. So maybe one thing we could do is we could like wrap set state in a function, right? So for example, I could say like function like logged set state, and this what we could do here is this could technically just call set state, and for example, we might get the value that our user wants it to change the state to, then we would just call set state to that value. Then, for example, we could say console.log of the value here or after or something like that. Now, note that set state kind of runs in a queue, like asynchronously kind of thing in the event loop. So we can't, like if I put this log before and then a log after, this is not really going to work. So let me show you what I mean. I'm gonna take this console log here. I take this console log here, which is the value. And what I want this function to return, just so you can see exactly what I'm trying to get at, is I'm going to return an array, because that's what we're destructuring. And this is the stateful value and then the function to change the state. So I'm going to return the stateful value, and I'm going to return the function to change the state, but I'm not going to return the original function. I'm going to return my wrapped function, which is this one, logged set state. Okay, so that when, little does the user know that we're actually like hooking into their set state call and doing these logs, and then we're just kind of calling the set state ourselves without them calling it directly. Okay, so let's test if this works and kind of the issues that we're going to run into. I'm going to go to my main, and I will say home, import home from ex2. There it is, and this is .jsx. And I'll save that, and I'll switch over to Chrome. Okay, so we have our counter and we have our state. So let's see what happens. I'm going to click go up by 1, and we get 1 and 1 logged. Okay, so not really what we wanted. So I'm going to click go up by 1. We get 2 and 2 logged, right? So I would expect to see like 1 and then 2, but I don't see that, right? Because set state is technically asynchronous. So this is going to run separately from when these run. These are going to run first. Okay, it's going to get scheduled to run later. So we can't really do this. And that's kind of the issue with how we have this working. The other issue is if I come here and I click go up by 5, we're going to get logged out the function that changes the state, which is not what we want either. And that technically is no good either. So we need kind of a way to figure out how to deal with this scenario as well. Okay. So let's start to fix these. So I'll comment this one out. This is probably not going to work. And we need a way to detect that the state has changed. So I want you to think for a second. What is a hook that we have available to us that we can use that will only run code when a stateful value changes? All right, that is the useEffect hook. So I'm going to bring that in, useEffect. And I'm going to say useEffect. And in this case, I'm going to say every single time state changes, right? I'm going to give it a dependency of every single time state changes. I'll say console.log state changed, and I'll give it the value. So in this case, actually, I'll do template string here just so we can actually see that nicely. State changed, and then we'll just do state, just like that. Okay. And I'm going to return the original set state function, because now I'm not returning this logged one anymore either, because it didn't work with the way that we have it set up over here. Okay, so let's see what happens here. We have a regular use state, and we have a use effect that's listening for that state to change, and all it's doing is a side effect, which is console logging that the state changed, and that's really all this function is doing. It's actually just returning the exact same values as our use state. So I'll come back here, I'll refresh the page, and I'll click, and we see that state changed 0, so that's good. I'll click go up by 1, state change 1, state change 2, I click go up by 5, state change 7, 12. Okay, great. So it's kind of working, right? Now, the only thing is that we only have the new value of state, right? Because this use effect is only going to give us the updated version of the state, because that's kind of the point of this effect. It's give us when this changes, after it's changed, please give us that value, and then we can use it inside here if we need to. Now, we want the previous value. There's no easy hook to do that. So one way that we can do that is use a ref, because we need to store the value of the state before it's been changed. and then we can update it as we need, but we want that to be independent of render. So let me show you what I mean. If I come in here and I say use ref as well, what I can say is I'll say const previous state is equal to use ref, and I'll give it the initial state as well. So that's going to be what it starts as, just like useState. And what we can then do is every single time the state changes, we can grab the old value, log it out, and then change it to the new value. So let me show you what I mean. State changed from, and then I'll say comma, and I'll say 2, and then I'll put in something here. All right. So what are we going to do here? Well, let's think about this. Inside this use effect, the state value right here, that's already been updated, right? That's already been changed. So technically that's the to value. So that's right here. Okay. So the from value is the one that we actually are having trouble finding. Well, this previous state right here that we have, the ref, doesn't get changed unless we manually change it ourselves, because it's just a reference value. It doesn't get impacted by re-renders. So actually inside of here is the original state value that we started off as. And remember, it's in the current property, which is by default. So I'll say previous state.current, which is a bit confusing in the context of this particular hook, because current means something else in this case. But hopefully, if you've seen the use ref video, that one makes sense. And if you haven't, definitely take a look at how we can store values in there by reference independent of the rendering loop. So this has the previous value of the state. Now what we can do is, after we're done that log, we can change that value manually. We can say previous state.current is now equal to the state value directly. So now it's being updated to the current value of the state after we have logged out the previous and current value. So in the next re-render, we will grab the previous value here again and log the new updated value, and then reset it to be the new updated value. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. That's actually all we need to do in this case to actually get this to work. So let me show you what this looks like. If I switch back here and I refresh the page, we'll get state change from 0 to 0, which technically is what happened. I'll click go up by 1. We'll see state change from 0 to 1, so that's really nice. Go up by 1, 1 to 2, 2 to 3. I'll click go up by 5, 3 to 8, 8 to 13, and 13 to 14. So that is pretty cool, right? So this first value is the ref. The second value is the actual stateful value itself. And then we're just updating the ref manually to store the reference that we need, which is independent of the render and not being updated automatically by React for us. So hopefully that one makes sense. That is one way to actually get this to work. It allows us to not really have to worry about which version of the set state is being used, because we're actually just passing in the original set state function, which is going to support all of those values, instead of us having to worry about kind of redoing it over here manually. Okay, so hopefully that one was fun for you and hopefully not too frustrating. I would love to see other potential solutions if you've come up with them. There are definitely a couple, but this I found was probably one of the quote unquote simpler ones to see. Okay, let's take a look at exercise 3. So this one again is a little bit of a doozy the first time that you do it. So a bit of a warning, but it's definitely worth it as you go through it for practice. So I'd like you to create a new React project for this one. This one's going to be called, we're going to create two files again, the same home one that we've been using, as well as a file called useQuery.jsx, and we're going to export a function called useQuery as well. If you use like a React query or use SWR and things like that, this might be slightly familiar. We're going to make useQuery a hook that takes a URL to fetch as an argument. Okay, so we're going to pass it a URL. Just like we pass useState the initial value, we're going to pass useQuery the URL to fetch immediately on mount. So the hook will fetch this URL on mount, but it will keep a cache of previously fetched URLs and their responses. And we're going to assume JSON for the data that comes back just for the purposes of this exercise. So it's going to cache by URL. Okay, which means the entire string that gets passed in, we're going to assume if it's the same URL that we've already seen it before, and we don't need to make that request. So this hook should return the current state value, which is the currently most recent fetched data, the JSON, as well as a function called fetcher. And that's going to allow a component to make future requests with a URL as an argument that is also going to use the cache that is internally being stored by useQuery. So this sounds a little bit confusing, but I'll just walk through it shortly in a second. Duplicate fetch URLs should return immediately from the cache in the hook. Otherwise, a fetch request is made and it's stored in the cache for future fetch calls. The way that we're going to use this is inside home, we're going to import and use useQuery and use a JSON API URL, very similar to ones at the Pokemon API, which is probably what I'll use for this demo. And we're going to make fetch request calls to display the stateful value inside home. So for example, if it was a Pokemon, maybe we can display the Pokemon name and height. And maybe in the case of a Pokemon, you can have like an input. And I think I mentioned it here, use the fetcher function to fetch another URL, for example, Pokemon, if it's a Pokemon API, by name, given a new value from an input field and a button to click to submit the fetch request. So what you want to do is you want to test that no network calls are made for duplicate URLs using the network tab in your browser DevTools. And then import this into main and actually test it out. So basically, long story short, the way that this is going to work is we're going to have a hook called useQuery. We're going to pass it a URL, okay? And immediately we're going to get back a stateful value that's going to be usable in our component. So for example, we can do something like this. We can say like const like data, and we'll say fetcher is equal to useQuery, and then we'll say like http:// whatever our URL is. Okay. The data is going to be stateful, so if that changes, we will have our component immediately re-render that's using that data. Like for example, conditionally, if it's like the name of a Pokemon or whatever it happens to be, some weather API or anything it happens to be. The fetcher is going to allow us to fetch more data to change this state with a new URL. So we would pass fetcher, for example, a new URL just like that. And then this would change data and re-render. All right. And we can probably hook this up to a button click, for example, and an input field so that every single time you search for a new piece of data, it's going to fetch. Now, the caveat here is that both this initial URL is cached inside the component, which means that if we make another duplicate request to that same URL, right? That's the key here. No pun intended. If we make a duplicate request to that URL, we're not going to make the fetch request. We're just immediately going to return the previous cached response, which we're going to assume is JSON. Same thing goes for the fetcher. If I fetch a URL that I've already fetched before, so for example, imagine in my input I type Pikachu, and then I make a fetch request for Pikachu. Then I'm searching for Charmander. Then I make a fetch request for Charmander. If I go back and I make another fetch request for Pikachu, I need to get Pikachu's data back immediately without another network call being made because we've already searched for Pikachu's data before and it probably hasn't changed. So it's being cached locally inside of this hook. Okay. However, that data is going to change and it's going to re-render to show Pikachu's information instead of Charmander in that particular example. All right. So quite a lot going on here. I left it a bit more vague as to how to set this up because we've seen examples of how to set this up, for example, in data fetching and some of the other exercises together. The key here is getting this hook working so that you can actually get the duplicated calls returned and cached, so you can get some practice creating a custom hook for data fetching and getting a bit of an intuition as to how some of the third-party ones might work behind the scenes, at least for things like caching. So give that a shot and then we will go through it together. Okay, so let's do this one. I'm super excited for this one. I love caching. I think I've said that a bunch of times. I really do. It's a lot of fun. Exercise 3 folder. I'll create a new file here, useQuery.jsx. I'll create my home.jsx as well. Inside useQuery, I'm going to create a function, useQuery. And I'm going to export a function of the same name, export default, useQuery. Okay, so what do we need this to do? Well, we're going to take a URL, right? So I'll just call this initial URL, just like that. Okay. And we're going to fetch that when this component first mounts in the DOM. So I already know that I need to do kind of two things here. I need a state and I need an effect, because the effect is going to be the fetch request. And then when that response comes back, I want to store it in some kind of state, because that's probably something we want to return to the user so they can use it inside of the component. So I'm going to grab useState, and I'm going to also grab useEffect from React. All right, there we go. So that's pretty nice. And I want this to be generic, right? It's not, I gave Pokemon as an example. So just like our previous example where we actually saw the state being used, I do want to make this generic. So I'll just say const data and then set data, not date, data. This is going to be useState. And to start, it's going to be null. Okay, I want to make sure that there's no data to start so that the user of this hook can use this to conditionally render whether the data has arrived or not. We could add more things later like loading states and things like that, but for now we'll leave it at this. Okay, so then what do I want to do? Well, I want to take a useEffect, and when this component mounts, which means that the dependency is an empty array, I want to make a fetch request to this URL. So I'm going to say fetch from this initial URL, okay? Then I'm going to do a .then. I don't know where that came from. I'm going to get back a response. And since we're using the fetch API, we're gonna if we're assuming JSON, and I'll just do that for now. Again, this would break. We should probably do some error handling here, like catch clauses, or just checking inside here and throwing our own exceptions, whatever it happens to be. I'm also not going to check for errors in this case, which is another thing that we would probably add. I'll mention some stretch things that you can add for practice if you like, but I'm going to just assume that this just comes back as a response.json. And I'm going to do .then. I'm going to get back that JSON object. What am I going to do with that? Well, I'm going to do set data to be JSON. Okay. So that's pretty good. So that actually works. I don't really see much wrong with this. So this is saying create this stateful value, set it on mount. I just need to return these values now. So I'm going to return data. I'm not going to return set data. I'm just going to return data. I'll put it in an array. Actually, you know what? I'm going to put this in an object just to show you how that would look. I'll return data just like that, and I'll explain why in a second. Okay, so yeah, that's pretty good. Just a heads up, if you do see this and you see my example here as a bit confusing because I mentioned data and fetcher, this would be destructuring an object instead of an array, depending on how you're actually structuring your use query. So in this case, I would want to replace this with an object destructuring, because right here I'm using an object. Just a heads up if you're confused about that. Okay, so I'm going to return data, which is going to be the key data with the actual value data here, which is going to be stateful. And the way we're going to use this, we have to add the refetcher in a second, but the way that we're going to use this, I'm going to go over to my home. I'm going to say function home. I'll say export default home. And I'm going to import my useQuery from useQuery.jsx. And what I want to do is I'm going to go to Chrome really quick. I'm going to go to Google. I'm going to search for the Pokemon API. You can use any API you like. This should be generic enough as long as it's JSON API for this example. I'm going to go to the Pokemon API, and I'll just grab the URL right here for, let's just do ditto. Copy that. I'll switch back. And I'll say const URL is equal to this. Okay. Then what I want to do is I'll say const Pokemon, or actually, sorry, this is going to be data. It just has to be the same name, is equal to useQuery, and I'm going to pass it that URL. I could have probably passed it in directly here, but just so that it doesn't go too far off the page here. Hopefully that makes sense. And that's all I need. Okay, so here I'm destructuring out of the useQuery hook this data property key. Okay, and I'm going to get that back out. Okay, so that's pretty good. Then what I'll do is I'll return and I'll do some JSX, and I'll do h1 and I'll say Pokemon app, just so that we know that that's actually rendering. And just for now, what I'll do is I'll create a p tag and I'll do a JSON stringify of my data, and I'll say give it a spacing of 2, just like that. Okay, just to see if this actually works. Okay, it's a nice trick so you don't have to keep opening your console to log it out. And what I'll then do is I'll go to my main, and I'll comment that one out, and I'll import my home, always the same name, ex3. There we go, .jsx. And that should replace it right there. So I'll switch back to my app, and we kind of missed it, but I'll refresh the page here. And you saw how for a split second it was null, and then we got back to data. Split second null, and then we get back to data. Hopefully you can see that. That is exactly what we'd expect. We see null show up, and then we see the actual data show up, which is nice. So let me make this a bit neater, just because that's kind of ugly to see all the stuff on the screen there. You know what I'll probably do is I'll say if there is data, I'll say grab the name. And then I'll do a comma, and I'll say if there is data, maybe I'll grab the data dot, data dot, let's just do height. Okay, and I'll say name, and I'll say height. This is going to be a bit weird because it's going to be null to start, but let's just go with that. So name ditto height 3. Great, name is going to be null for a brief second, or it's going to show nothing, and then we're going to get those values to show up. And we can see that request going through because if I go to my network tab and I refresh the page, what we'll see here is that ditto request right down here. And we're seeing 2 because of the way that this works in dev mode for strict mode. So we're going to run it 2 times. Not too much of an issue for us, so that's okay. Okay, now that's pretty nice. So that actually works. That solves kind of half the issue. That solves this part right here, where we're going to make the request when it mounts. Now we also want to return this fetcher function to fetch more data in the future that also gets cached, and we're also not really caching it the first time either. So let's fix those 2 issues. What I'll do here is I'll also add a kind of like a stateful value. Actually, I'll do it after. I just realized I probably want the fetcher working first. I'll do it after. So what we want to do is we want to return a fetcher as well. So I'm going to create a function. I'll call this, I said fetcher because I didn't want to overwrite fetch that comes from the default web API fetch. I want to just create my own fetcher. You could probably call this like a refetcher or something. Some APIs use that. I'll just call it fetcher for now. Whatever you like, doesn't really matter too much. And my goal is to do this. I want to return fetcher as well, just so that can be used to refetch data. So let's kind of think about this. We want it to cache data. So we need to store responses as they come in so that the same response is being sent back immediately from the cache if it's the same URL, right? So what that means is if I search for ditto again, right, I should not have to make the request out to the Pokemon API for ditto. I'm going to grab it immediately that was stored previously. So one way to do this is using refs, right? Because we technically don't need this to be stateful. We just want to store data in our component. We could probably create files to do this and create a whole bunch of extra stuff surrounding it, but this hook should be relatively self-contained without any extra side effects. So usually what you'll see is this is stored maybe in like another variable or something like a ref, which is quite a useful thing to have. So I'm going to say const, and I'll call this data cache is equal to useRef. And I'm going to start this as a new map. Okay, you could technically use an object. I like maps because the API is very obvious as to what we're going to be doing for caching specifically. Okay, now, what are we going to do? Well, let's deal with the case of the first fetch because we actually want to make sure that we cache this response when it comes back. So I need to store that in this cache. So I'm going to actually extend this here. And before or after I set the data, I also want to store it in the cache. So I'm going to say data cache dot current because the current is the value or the property that you would usually store stuff in React. We could create a new key. It doesn't really matter, whichever is easier for you. but we have to be some key on this object. So I'll just go with the current because that's the default. And this is going to be our map, right? Data cache.current is going to be the value of the ref, which is our map. And we're going to set the key to the value. So what's the key? Well, in the initial URL, remember this is only going to happen on mount. The key is going to be the initial URL because we're caching by URL. And the value is going to be the JSON, right? This JSON right here. So I'm going to set the cache's key to be the URL, which is going to be this whole string. And the cache's value to be the JSON, which is going to be that object, JavaScript object notation, that object that comes back from this cache. Okay, I'm also going to set the state to be that JSON as well. Now, this cache in our hook is going to have this inside of it the very first time. So that's pretty nice. All right, so let's think about fetching next. So our fetch is going to take a, I'll call this URL to fetch. So what do we want to do? Well, in here, we're probably going to do the same thing as we did here. Right? We're going to fetch that data from this URL. But the difference is that we want to make sure that it's not already cached. So we want to check if the data is already cached. And here I'm just going to put I'll put a log, I'll put cache this network call for the future. Right, so if we do search for that exact Pokemon that we searched for on mount, it will be in a cache as well, which is kind of nice. So if our cache, data cache, remember it's on the current, .current. I'm actually going to be using current quite a lot in this function, so I don't want to keep typing that. So I'm going to say const cache is equal to data cache .current, just so I don't have to keep typing this all the time because it's kind of annoying. So I'm just going to make it easier, so just so it reads a bit nicer. So I'll say if our cache.has, to search for a key, the URL that we're fetching, right? If it does have that, then I want to return cache.get that URL, the value at that URL, right? So if it's in the cache, this is a cache hit. Okay. Now we're going to do the cache miss, which means that if it's not in the cache. So I'll put this on one line. Usually I put curly brackets around this or something, but I'll just keep it succinct here. We're not going to get past this if it's not true, right? So I can safely put code here without putting an else because this has a return immediately. Okay. Now, if it is a cache miss, which means that it's not in the cache, well, we need to fetch it. So we have to fetch it and store it in the cache. Fetch the data, I guess, and store it in the cache. So I'll say we'll make the fetch request, regular fetch API to that URL that we're fetching, right? Then we're going to get back a response, and we're going to do response.json. Because we're assuming JSON in this case. Again, we're not going to check for errors or loading states or any of that just for now, just to keep it simple. Then we're going to get back that JSON. And what are we going to do with that JSON? Well, we're going to do a couple of things. We want to cache it, cache the response. So I'm going to say, because we know that it's not been cached, right? If we get to the spot here, we know that it's a cache miss. So I'm going to say cache dot set. And remember, I can do this because I've grabbed cache as data cache.current, right? So I'll grab that current property off of here. I'm just renamed it to cache. Cache.set URL to fetch to be that JSON value. And then I'm going to set data to be that JSON value as well. Okay. Now, in the future, this is going to come through here. And if we search for the same URL, we're going to hit this case and we're going to immediately return it from the cache. We're never going to come and fetch it again. Also, there's some duplicate code here. This is kind of duplicate to this, so maybe there's some refactoring opportunity there, but it's okay in this case. I think it's not too bad. It kind of, it's reasonable. You know, maybe you want to refactor it, maybe not. The bigger issue, in my opinion here, is that we're not catching errors. We don't really have a nice loading state that's very obvious. There's a couple other issues that we could probably fix up if we really wanted to get nice and fancy. So that's pretty much it, right? So now are returning this function that takes a new URL, and this is going to do all of this cool stuff for us. And we either are going to have a cache result or a not cache result. And that's going to be stored in our ref, which is right here, which is our map. So this is our cache for our component, and then this is the stateful value for our component. So our component is going to return both the stateful value data as well as fetcher, which is this function that does all the fetching with caching for us. We're not going to return the set data because the user of this hook doesn't need to set the data directly because the whole point of this hook is to actually not allow them to do that, because we want to be able to actually check to see if it's in a cache first, depending on what is being changed. Okay, so now if I come back here, I can also grab that fetcher from my useQuery. And now I can use that to fetch more data if I need to. So how would we use this? Well, let me add a input here. I'll put an input, I'll do type text. And I'll just put a placeholder. I'll just say, Pokemon name, why not? And I'll do a button here, and I'll do search Pokemon. It's a bit succinct, but we'll go with that. Now I want this to fetch some data, so I'll say an on click, and I'll just make a function I'll call fetch Pokemon. I could do this inline, but as you know, I like to kind of keep my my logic outside of my JSX because it's cleaner to read if I put the logic all up here. So I'll say function fetch Pokemon. And I need a way to actually access this inputs data. So I could do this a couple ways. I could make this state, or I could use a ref. So you know what, let's just use state in this case, because I think I used ref in a previous example. So I'll say useState from React this time, and I'll say const Pokemon name set Pokemon name is equal to useState. I just realized this can get rid of my placeholder actually. So my placeholder is not going to show at all, because what I'm going to do is I'm going to create this as a controlled value. The value is going to be Pokemon name. So technically I don't actually need this placeholder, but it's okay. You can see how that would work, and then why that makes sense shortly. So I'm going to create that as a stateful value, but now I need to add an on change here. So I'll do that. I'll say on change, and this is going to call. I'll just put this in line just so you can see both ways of having the logic in here. And I'll say set Pokemon name to be, this is going to grab the event. This is going to be event.target.value. Okay. And I'll save that, and it's going to reformat it for me so they're all on different lines. This is actually not going to do anything in this case. This is making it a controlled input. So the inputs value is going to be a stateful value that's always going to change on the change event, and that's going to be coming from right here. Okay, so if I switch back here, what we'll see is that I can type in here, and that's going to control that state immediately. So fetch Pokemon is then going to be called when I click on this button, and now I have access to the Pokemon name. So what I can probably do is I can kind of do some finagling here. What I could say is I'll do my fetcher. And I'm going to call it with this URL. Except I'll make this a template string. And the Pokemon name in this case, so that's the thing that's changing from call to call. So I'm going to make this part templated, and this is going to have the Pokemon name in it. So I'm going to search for whatever is in that Pokemon name. Now, again, this is probably going to break if we give it a wrong Pokemon name. So, test the ones that work, unless you want to start adding error handling, which I'll mention at the end of this exercise. But, excuse me, that's all this fetcher is going to do. We're going to fetch data, and this hook right here, this function is going to be this function right here, right? It's going to call this function right here. I almost looked at the wrong one. It's going to pass it the URL, and this function is responsible for caching it and then returning it right away, or fetching it and returning it right away if we have that. So I guess actually what I'm going to do here is I just realized a mistake. technically this function is returning cache.get URL. So if you saw this, great. This is not actually what we wanted to do. Technically, what I want to do is set the state to be this value because we're not actually using it directly in this case like a regular function. We're using this as a stateful component. So I'm actually going to get rid of this. This is going to be a cache hit still. I'll just move this up here. Oops, I moved my bracket as well, cache hit. So I want to set this to be the state. So set state to be this cached value. So this is going to be set data to be this value right here. Okay. And what this is going to do, very similar to the cache miss, where we're going to be storing in the cache and setting data to be that JSON. We're going to be setting data to be the value that we're getting from the cache for that URL. If it's a cache hit, right? If it's in that cache, then we want to statefully change this value, which is going to change data, which is going to re-render whatever is using data in this component. So both the cache hit and the cache miss are going to be statefully changing data in this case, which is what we want. And then we can always rely on data being the correct updated value, whether it's from the cache or from the API, almost seamlessly without the actual component needing to know. If we returned, this is actually probably a good place for me to say this. If I had to return something different for the cached case, that would, in my opinion, be bad API design or bad hook design in this case, because the user of the hook is going to have to remember, okay, well, something different happens asynchronously in this case. If there's a cache miss versus the cache hit, I get the return value right away. So we shouldn't return right away, which is the mistake I made previously. We want to make sure that we actually are doing the same thing asynchronously with both cases where we're expecting to change the data state. So hopefully that one makes sense. And that's what this is doing, right? This, as soon as we click that button, we're going to make a fetch. This fetch right here that we wrapped around is going to be changing this data value right here, which is a useState. This data is a useState value, just like if it would be copied and pasted into this component. And we know when data changes, this right here is going to re-render with that new stateful value. Okay, what I should probably do is also reset the state. So I could do like set Pokemon name to be empty, for example. So I'll show you how I could do that on fetch Pokemon. I'll say set Pokemon name. This will clear the input field to be an empty string. All right, so let me refresh the page here, and I'll clear out my network tab, and we can see that there's Ditto to start. Okay, so Ditto is in there. I'm gonna then search for Pikachu. I'll click search Pokemon. I have the network tab open. What I expect to see is a network request for Pikachu. Okay, and then I expect to see Pikachu's data over here. So Pikachu's name and then Pikachu's height. I'll click search Pokemon. There is our network request right here. It's a 200 request to the API. We get back all of, let me make this a bit bigger so we can really see that. We get all of Pikachu's data back here. That's all Pikachu's data right there. And we can kind of see that in our nice preview right here. And we get back Pikachu's data, and there we have it. We have height of Pikachu for 4 and Pikachu's name as well. Now, I'm going to search for Ditto, D-I-T-T-O, which was our first mounted Pokemon fetch. I should not see another network request for Ditto because it should be in the cache. I'll click search Pokemon, and I do see a network request for Ditto. So something did go wrong in this case. Let me just make sure I did this correctly. If I search for Pikachu, I'm probably going to see that. So I did something wrong here. Pikachu's network request, right? So I did something wrong here, which is probably good. I can actually see this working, hopefully. Disable the cache. Is that correct? Yeah, I think that's fine. I think I just genuinely did something wrong in this case. So this is not what we want. So let's debug this together. Probably a good debugging opportunity. What's happening is when we're making that fetch request, that cache hit is not happening, and we're actually coming out. And I think I already know what the issue is, which is kind of what I fixed earlier, or half fixed earlier. So if I switch back to my useQuery hook, what we'll see is that this fetcher is actually doing a bunch of things here. So I actually do need to stop the rest of this from running with a return. And this is a bit of the danger of having those one-line return functions as well, as I forgot to actually break out of this by returning and not coming down here. So even though we had a cache hit, I was coming down here and I had a cache miss. So just to show you that bug, I'll do a console log here. I'll do console log and I'll say cache hit, and I'll put the URL, and I'll just copy this here and I'll say cache miss for this URL. I'll leave this return out and we'll see kind of what's happening. So hopefully you can see it, but I'll just refresh this page just so we can see exactly what's happening here. All right, so I'll go to my console and I'll search for Pikachu. Pikachu is a cache miss, so that makes sense. I'll search for a Ditto. Search. Then I get a cache hit and a cache miss. And I'll search for a Pikachu, and I get a cache hit and a cache miss again. Okay, so that makes sense, which is what we just looked at. And the issue is we didn't return early from this function, so we just continued even though there was a cache hit, which is not what we wanted to do. We want to make sure that we don't come down here if we have the data in our cache, so we don't make that fetch request. We want to avoid making that fetch request. We just want to get it directly from the cache. So let's see if that works. I'll refresh the page here, and I'll go to my network tab really quick. I'll clear that out. I'll search for Pikachu. Moment of truth. I'm pretty sure this is going to work. I'll search Pokemon. There's our Pikachu, right? Pikachu height 4. I'll search now for Ditto, which was already technically in the cache because that was what happened in the component mounted. I'll click search, fingers crossed, and there we go, right? Ditto showed up, height of 3, but no URL or no fetch request with that URL because it was not, it was already in the cache, right? So if I switch back here, we'll see cache miss for Pikachu, cache hit for Ditto because Ditto was in the cache. If I search for, let's do Charmander, I guess you'd have to know some of the Pokemon. I only know a few. I'll click search. Charmander is now being fetched. And if I go to console, cache miss for Charmander. But if I click search for Charmander again, I will see cache hit for Charmander, and we will not see another network request for Charmander. That was coming directly from our cache, as well as this data being updated. So check this out. If I click Ditto in here, search, Ditto gets updated, no fetch request, Pikachu, super, super fast. This is already in the cache. We are not making future fetch requests to our API or to a third-party API. The only trade-off here is the actual memory is increasing as we're caching this data. So there is definitely a trade-off that we are making. So before I kind of wrap this one up, I do want to give you a couple of areas that you could probably try to improve this. I would encourage you to look at already existing data fetching hooks so you can kind of see some examples of other things that they might be returning, right? So you can see that we're returning the stateful value and like a refetcher function. You could imagine what it would be like to return an error state. Like, is there an error? Then you could return like a Boolean or the error message. You could return a loading state. You could return all sorts of other really cool things so that the user of this hook, or if you're using your own hook in the future, can get access to that information. And you can use the various kind of versions of the fetch API or different parts of the use effect and state changing and error handling to actually wrap that all quite nicely into one big hook so that your actual component can be pretty lean, right? Like if you look at this is pretty nice. There's no like all we did was just like we assumed that data was there and check it out. Like if I had more information like loading or error states, I could probably make this even nicer looking if I wanted to by just making this hook a little bit more heavy on the logic, and I could reuse that across every single component. So I encourage you to try that for fun, for extra practice or as a bonus, but I hope that these exercises were valuable for you. And you can hopefully see how these custom hooks are so valuable, and where when you actually see these in the wild and you start pulling them down from like NPM and things like that, and you start using them yourself, hopefully you can see what's happening behind the scenes is not actually that hard. It's just using these lifecycle hooks in like an intuitive way so that you can actually worry less about the internal workings of things and worry more about how you're actually displaying that data in your component, which is kind of the point. So I hope you found these exercises interesting and valuable and fun. If you did, I'd love it if you could like the video and subscribe to the channel. If you do want to support the channel more, I have a Patreon set up and YouTube memberships and super thanks as well. So those are all options you can use. that actually almost pretty much wraps up the React series, believe it or not. What we're going to do in the next video or set of videos together are a project or maybe two to actually go through wrapping some of these concepts together, hopefully in another fun, a bit more long version of the exercises that's a bit more involved and maybe something you could put on your portfolio. But really everything that we've done up to this point, if you've been following along with the series, is pretty much the core of React and everything you'll need to actually get started building your own applications. Everything from something super small all the way up to the medium and even the larger scale applications that require many developers on a team. So I'm super excited to get to the actual project and actually start building a few tools together. I will hopefully see you in those videos. See you later.